So I'm working on a little table runner. I found this really cute embroidery pattern that I used, and I'm going to block out the center with these strips on the side, and then on the edges we'll have these little 9 patches. So first I cut some strips of fabric that are 3/4 of an inch thick, and what we'll do is we'll sew them along. I've got them a little bit long. These ones are really quite long, but the reason is once I sew it, then I'll trim it so that it's square. But sometimes if you cut it exactly and then you sew it, it will not be perfectly square. It'll warp a little bit as it's sewed or ironed or whatever. So that's the reason why I've left these long. These ones, that's just the width of the fabric, so I just left them at that, and I'll trim them down at the end. But so that's what I'm doing at the moment, is going to sew these on to the edges right here and here. Once that's done, I'll trim them, press them open, and then I'll do the same thing with these pieces. Sew them on like this, trim and press open. Alright, so we've sewed on the pieces, we've pressed it. Now I'm just going to use this little straight edge to trim up the edges. Continue on these sides. Alright, so then we'll sew on these pieces right here and do the same thing. Okay, so I've cut some strips that are 2.5 by 9.5, and we're going to sew them to the top and to the bottom of the block, just like this one. Okay, so you want to press the seam toward the colors, not towards the white, because you'll be able to see the fabric through the white a lot easier. Alright, we'll do the same thing with our centerpiece. The only difference is these pieces are 2.5 by 11.5, because this is a little bit longer than our 9 patches. Next, we're going to make the pieces that go in between each block. So I've cut 4 9.5 by 2.5 by 9.5, and 8 2.5 by 2.5 squares. So I'm going to sew these on, and then when we open them up, they'll go like this. Alright, so we've made our little pieces for the centers. So we're just going to go through, sew them on, press them flat, sew on the next piece, press, sew on. So our table runner top is done. We've got the little 9 patches done, the embroidery, and it's all sewn together. So what I did last night, I didn't film it because it was getting dark, is I stitched along the squares. And basically I cut a piece of batting that is the same size as the top, and then I stitched it on. I've also cut a piece of backing, and then right now I'm pinning it all together so that we can complete the project. Okay, so it's all pinned together, and I'm just going to run to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch along these rows right here and along here, and then after that we'll do the binding. So I'm using this ready-made bias tape. It's called double fold bias tape quilt binding. It's extra wide. It's about 3/4 of an inch. And the reason I'm using this is because I don't have any more of this. I think this color, this checker red and white would look super cute, but I don't have any. So just gonna use the plain old white. So with the bias tape, there's one side that is a little bit longer. So like if you can tell, the back is a little bit, just barely longer than the front. And so I like to use this on the back so that when I'm putting it in place, stick it there and then I sew along, I'm for sure going to catch that back. If I put the other side on top and sewed along, I could possibly miss the other side. So that's kind of my little trick of which way to put it on. So okay, so I like to start a little bit away from the edge. That gives you room to fold and turn your piece when you get to the end and have a little bit of straight spot at the end. So I'm just going to pin the bias tape along the edge until I get to the first turn, the first corner. Okay, so I've got to the end. I've left just maybe 1/2 inch, maybe a little more, that I haven't sewn. And so now I need to turn the bias tape. I don't know that there's a right way or a wrong way to do this. This is how I'm doing it. Taking the front and kind of making it so that it goes into a kind of an angle right there, and then the same thing on the back. And I will pin it in place and then pin all this along the bottom edge. Okay, so I'll show you one more time how I did this. So it's just straight and I'm folding it over like this, and it kind of just makes a little angle, and then you just kind of mess with it till it looks pretty and sew it in place. So I have the binding all the way around until the end, so I'm going to repeat the same process for the corner and then pin it in place. But here's what I do at the end. Super easy, just kind of fold it up like this, and so then when it comes over, there's not a raw edge. And of course I'll pin this all in place and make it look good and then sew it in place. So the binding is all on, and I thought it looked a little bit plain with the white border. So I'm adding a running stitch along. And so here's kind of how I'm doing it. So you'll start with a piece of embroidery thread. I'm using 3 strands, and it needs to be at least as long as the length. So when you're doing it this way, it's got to be really long because you don't want to have to stop in the middle. But so here's, let me see if we can see here. We've got these corners right here, which is perfect, so we can tuck our string underneath. I've knotted the end, and then that knot can just hide underneath there and you don't see it, and then we can do our running stitch along. I'm being careful as I do it not to go through all of the fabric because I don't want it to show on the back. If you wanted it to, then go ahead and go through all of it. So we'll just go ahead and do a little running stitch. Try to keep them as even as possible. I'm not always the best at doing that, but it looks nice if it's nice and even. Okay, so we've got to the edge. What I'm going to do is run my stitch clear underneath here, and then I'll just do a little knot underneath where that little fold is, and then when you press it over, I'll clip that off. and then you can't see the little knot.